The Galactic Council Chamber floated in orbit above a gas giant called Nexar Prime. It was a station built 40,000 years ago, when the first 5 species had agreed to unite under a single governing body. Over the centuries, the station had grown larger and more complex, adding new sections for each new species that joined or was conquered. Now it stretched for hundreds of miles, a city in space where the fate of 1,000 worlds was decided. High Chancellor Morath sat at the center of the great circular chamber. He was ancient, even by the standards of his species, the Vreth, who could live for 10,000 years. His skin was gray and wrinkled like old paper. His eyes were clouded with age, but still sharp with intelligence. He had ruled the council for 3 centuries, and in that time, he had overseen the submission of 47 species. Humanity would simply be the 48th. The council members took their seats around him in a rising spiral of platforms. Each platform represented a species. Each species had earned its place through service to the council, which in practice meant paying tribute and providing soldiers when called upon. This was the natural order of the galaxy. The strong ruled, the weak served. It had always been this way. Ambassador Zethral stood before the assembly and delivered his report on the human situation. He described the meeting in Central Park. He noted the shock and fear on the faces of the human leaders. He expressed confidence that humanity would accept the tribute terms when they understood the alternative. High Chancellor Morath listened without expression. When Zethral finished, the Chancellor opened the floor for discussion. General Krath of the Vorath Dominion spoke first. He was a military commander who had personally led the destruction of 6 rogue species during his career. His voice was deep and filled with contempt. He described humanity as a primitive civilization, barely worth the Council's attention. Their fleet numbered only 300 warships. Their fastest ships could achieve Factor 7 in hyperspace, while Council ships could reach Factor 15. Their weapons were simple kinetic projectiles and low-grade plasma cannons that would barely scratch the hull of a Vorath cruiser. The Vorath Dominion alone possessed 12,000 capital ships, General Krath reminded the assembly. Any one of those ships could reduce a human city to ash in minutes. If the humans were foolish enough to resist, the war would be over before it truly began. Several council members nodded in agreement. The numbers were overwhelming. The technology gap was vast. Humanity had no chance of victory in a direct confrontation. But one voice offered a note of caution. Councillor Yethra of the Silthene Confederacy rose from her platform. Her species were known for their patience and their long memories. She reminded the assembly that the Silthene had encountered humans once before, 12 years ago, during an unauthorized first contact on a frontier world. A single human patrol ship had detected 3 Silthene cruisers in orbit. By all logic, the human ship should have retreated immediately. It was outgunned and outmatched in every measurable way. Instead, the human captain had attacked without hesitation. The battle lasted only minutes. The human ship was destroyed, but not before it had rammed one Silthene cruiser and crippled another with a suicide run. The human crew had fought to the last person. They had not surrendered. They had not asked for mercy. They had simply fought until they died. Councillor Yethra suggested that this behavior indicated something unusual about humans. They were aggressive beyond reason. They did not calculate odds the way other species did. They did not retreat when retreat was the logical choice. This made them unpredictable, and unpredictable enemies were dangerous enemies. High Chancellor Morath considered her words for a moment, then dismissed them with a wave of his withered hand. One ship's bravery meant nothing against 12,000. Aggression without numbers was just stupidity. The humans would see reason when faced with the reality of council power. Every species did eventually. The discussion continued for several hours. Intelligence reports were presented and analyzed. Satellite imagery showed unusual activity at human shipyards. But the Council's analysts concluded this was likely preparation for surrender rather than resistance. The humans were probably building transport ships to deliver their tribute. Communications traffic in human space had increased dramatically, but all of it was encrypted using methods the Council could not break. This was mildly concerning, but not alarming. Primitive species often scrambled their communications when faced with first contact. It was a natural response to fear. General Krath requested permission to position a strike fleet near human space, just in case. He proposed a force of 1,200 warships, enough to crush any resistance the humans might offer. High Chancellor Marath approved the request. It was a sensible precaution, even if it would probably not be needed. As the session concluded, the Chancellor made a final statement. He reminded the Assembly that the Council had maintained order in the galaxy for 40,000 years. They had faced larger empires than humanity. They had crushed more advanced civilizations than humanity. They had broken the will of species that had fought for centuries, before finally accepting their place in the natural order. Humanity was young. Humanity was small. Humanity was alone in a galaxy that had already been claimed and divided long before their ancestors had learned to make fire. They would submit, or they would die. Those were the only two options. There were no others. The Council members returned to their ships and their homeworlds with confidence in their hearts. The human situation was a minor administrative matter, nothing more. Within 30 days, it would be resolved, and the tribute would begin flowing, as it always had from conquered species. None of them noticed the small maintenance drone that had been recording the entire session. None of them knew that the drone was not actually a maintenance unit at all, but a surveillance device planted by human operatives 3 years earlier. None of them suspected that every word spoken in the Great Chamber had been transmitted across space to a listening post hidden in an asteroid field, where human intelligence officers were already analyzing the information. The Council believed they knew everything about humanity. They had observed humans for 300 years. They had studied human technology and human behavior. They thought they understood what they were dealing with. They were wrong. Humanity had been watching them too. Humanity had been learning. Humanity had been preparing. And in the shadows of the galaxy, far from the eyes of Council censors, humanity had been building something that would change everything. The Council expected tribute. They expected submission. They expected the same outcome they had achieved 47 times before. But humanity had never read the script. Humanity had never agreed to play the role of the conquered. And in the war rooms and research facilities of human space, a very different plan was taking shape. One that would teach the Galactic Council a lesson they would never forget. Deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, in a bunker that appeared on no official map, Admiral Daniel Harris stood before a wall of screens showing faces from across human space. Colonial governors from 17 worlds watched through secure quantum links. Military commanders from every branch of service sat in the underground chamber around him. The air was thick with tension and the hum of powerful computers. Secretary Lisa Monroe had spent the past 2 weeks coordinating the most important decision in human history. Every nation on Earth had voted. Every colony had been consulted. The result was unanimous. Humanity would not pay tribute. Humanity would not surrender its people as slaves. Humanity would fight. But fighting required more than courage. It required weapons, strategy, and intelligence. And as Admiral Harris began his briefing, the assembled leaders learned that humanity had been preparing for this moment far longer than anyone outside this room had known. 15 years ago, a young scientist named Dr. Kevin Marshall had detected something strange in the outer reaches of the solar system. It was a small probe, no bigger than a car, drifting silently through the darkness between planets. When he reported his findings to military intelligence, they told him to keep quiet and keep watching. That probe was the first proof that humanity was not alone, and it was also the first warning that whoever was out there might not be friendly. Dr. Marshall was recruited into a secret program called Project Lighthouse. His mission was simple: prepare humanity for first contact, and prepare for the worst. Over the following years, working in hidden facilities on asteroids and moons far from Earth, he and his team had developed technologies that even most human governments did not know existed. Now, Dr. Marshall stood beside Admiral Harris and presented those technologies to the gathered leaders. The first was called the Cascade Torpedo. It looked like an ordinary missile, but inside it contained something revolutionary. When it struck a target, it did not simply explode. Instead, it created a tiny tear in the fabric of space itself. This tear lasted only a fraction of a second, but that was enough. Everything within range of the tear was pulled apart at the molecular level. Shields meant nothing. Armor meant nothing. A single Cascade torpedo could destroy a ship from the inside out, and there was no known defense against it. The second technology was the Phantom Drive. Council ships traveled through hyperspace, a dimension that allowed faster-than-light travel, but also left a trail that could be tracked and detected. The Phantom Drive worked differently. It slipped ships into a layer of space that existed between normal space and hyperspace, a place the Council did not even know existed. Ships using the Phantom Drive were invisible to all known sensors. They could travel anywhere without being detected. The third technology was something that made even Admiral Harris uncomfortable. It had no official name. The scientists simply called it the Hammer. It was a weapon of last resort, a device that could cause a star to collapse in on itself, destroying everything within its solar system. One hammer could end a civilization. The humans had built 3 of them, hoping they would never need to use any. Dr. Marshall finished his presentation and stepped aside. The room was silent. Several governors looked pale. The weapons were impressive, but they were also terrifying. The question on everyone's mind was whether humanity could really use such things. Admiral Harris answered that question without being asked. He told the assembly that war was not a game. It was not a contest of honor or a test of courage. War was about survival. The Council had made clear that refusal meant extinction. They had promised to erase humanity from existence, just as they had erased the Cathani 4,000 years ago. Against such an enemy, mercy was suicide, and hesitation was death. Commander Samantha Price of Special Operations stepped forward to deliver the next part of the briefing. She was a small woman, with short gray hair, and eyes that had seen things most people could not imagine. For the past decade, she had run a network of human agents throughout Council space. Using genetic modification technology, her operatives had been altered to look like lesser species within the Council hierarchy. They had lived among the aliens for years, learning their languages, mapping their military installations, and stealing their secrets. They knew the patrol routes of every Council fleet within 100 light-years. They had the command codes for Vorath military ships. They knew the locations of the 3 major fleet anchorages where thousands of Council warships were stationed. Commander Price displayed a holographic map of nearby space. Red dots indicated Council military assets. Blue dots indicated human positions. The red dots outnumbered the blue by more than 40 to 1, but the blue dots were in motion, spreading out along routes that passed through gaps in Council surveillance. The human fleet had already left home space, traveling silently through the void on Phantom Drives, positioning itself for a strike the Council would never see coming. Governor Nathan Cole of Mars Colonies spoke up. He was a civilian, not a soldier, and he asked the question that all the civilians were thinking. What if this plan failed? What if the Council's power was simply too great? What happened then? Admiral Harris looked at him for a long moment before answering. He said that failure was not something they could afford to consider. But if the worst happened, humanity would not go quietly. Every ship would fight until it could not fight anymore. Every soldier would stand until they fell. And the hammers would be deployed against the Council's most important worlds. If humanity was going to be exterminated, Admiral Harris said, then the Council would learn the true cost of that decision. They would lose more in victory than they had ever lost in any war before. They would remember humanity for 10,000 years, not as a conquered species, but as the civilization that made the mighty Galactic Council bleed. The briefing ended, and the leaders returned to their duties. Ships were loaded with weapons. Soldiers said goodbye to their families. Across human space, billions of people looked up at the stars and wondered what the next few days would bring. The Council had given humanity 30 days to submit. 29 of those days had passed. On the 30th day, the Council would receive their answer. It would not be the answer they expected. On the morning of the 30th day, Ambassador Zethral received a message from human space. He had expected a long document filled with formal language and requests for negotiation. Instead, he received a single word: no. He stared at the screen for several minutes, certain there must be some mistake. No species had refused tribute in over 1,000 years. The last civilization foolish enough to try had been burned from the face of their own planet. Surely the humans understood this. Surely they were not so stupid as to choose extinction over service. But the message was clear. Humanity had refused. Zethral immediately contacted High Chancellor Morath with the news. The Chancellor's response was swift and without emotion. He ordered General Kraft to mobilize the strike fleet and proceed to Earth at maximum speed. Now they would face the consequences. 1,200 Vorath warships activated their engines and began the journey toward human space. Each ship was a mountain of metal and weapons, crewed by soldiers who had conquered dozens of worlds. General Kraft stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, and imagined the terror the humans would feel when they saw his fleet darken their skies. This would be a quick war, he thought. Perhaps the quickest in Council history. He was half right. The war was quick, but it did not go the way General Kraft expected. While the Vorath fleet traveled toward Earth, the human fleet had already reached its first target. Korath Station was the largest military anchorage in Council space, a massive structure orbiting a dead moon where 8,000 warships were kept in reserve. Most of these ships had skeleton crews or no crews at all. They were the Council's emergency fleet, ready to be activated if a major war ever broke out. Admiral Harris watched the station grow larger on his viewscreen as the USS Liberty and 300 human ships dropped out of Phantom Drive. For a moment, there was silence. The Council sensors had not detected their approach. The station's defenses had not activated. The thousands of warships floating in neat rows around the structure remained dark and dormant. Then, Admiral Harris gave the order to fire. Cascade torpedoes streaked across the void, their trails invisible to the naked eye. They struck the station's shield generators first, tearing them apart in flashes of twisted light. The station's alarms began to wail, but it was already too late. More torpedoes hit the power systems, the communications arrays, the command center. Within minutes, Korath Station was dark and crippled, its corridors filled with smoke and the screams of dying crew members. But Admiral Harris was not satisfied with destroying the station. The 8,000 warships around it were a greater threat. If they were activated, they could turn the tide of any future battle. They needed to be eliminated. Commander Price's intelligence network had provided something valuable: the command codes for Vorath military systems. These codes could remotely access any Vorath ship and override its controls. It was a backdoor that the Vorath had built into their own vessels as a security measure, never imagining that an enemy might one day obtain it. Human technicians transmitted the codes to the dormant fleet. 3,000 ships accepted the commands and locked themselves down, their systems frozen, their weapons disabled. The remaining 5,000 had older systems that did not respond to the codes, but without crews to operate them, they were just floating metal. The attack on Korath Station lasted 17 minutes from start to finish. When it was over, the Council had lost nearly half of its reserve fleet capacity. But the humans were not done. While the main fleet struck the station, Commander Price led a special operations team to Nexar 7, a moon that housed the Council's primary communications relay. This facility connected all Council military forces across 3 sectors of space. Without it, fleets could not coordinate, orders could not be transmitted, and the carefully organized military machine of the Council would fall into chaos. The facility was defended by 2,000 Silthene soldiers. Commander Price's team numbered 48. They landed under cover of darkness, their dropship painted in colors that made it nearly invisible against the gray stone of the moon's surface. They moved in silence through underground tunnels that human agents had mapped years earlier. They reached the facility's outer walls without being detected. The battle began when a Silthene sentry spotted movement and raised the alarm. From that moment, the fighting was brutal and close. Human soldiers in powered armor clashed with Silthene defenders in corridors too narrow for either side to maneuver. Grenades exploded in confined spaces. Bodies fell and were stepped over as the fighting continued. Commander Price led from the front. She was 62 years old, but she moved like someone half her age. Her rifle never stopped firing as she pushed deeper into the facility, stepping over fallen enemies and fallen friends alike. When her ammunition ran out, she picked up a Silthene weapon and kept fighting. 4 hours later, the battle ended. 31 humans remained standing out of the original 48. Over 1,800 Silthene defenders were dead. The communications relay was a smoking ruin, its equipment destroyed beyond repair. Across Council space, military commanders suddenly found themselves unable to contact each other. Orders from the Council chamber went unanswered. Ships on patrol stopped receiving updates. The organization that had ruled the galaxy for 40,000 years was now blind and deaf. General Kraft's fleet was halfway to Earth when his communications went dark. He tried to contact High Chancellor Morath, but received only static. He tried to contact Korath Station, but received no response. A terrible feeling began to grow in his stomach, a feeling he had not experienced in centuries. Then a message arrived on his personal channel. It was from Admiral Daniel Harris. The message was short and direct. Admiral Harris informed the general that Korath Station had been destroyed. He informed him that the Council's communications network had been eliminated. He informed him that the human fleet was now positioned between the Vorath fleet and home, cutting off any chance of retreat. And then Admiral Harris made an offer. The Vorath fleet could turn around and return to Council space. If they did, no more blood needed to be spilled. But if they continued toward Earth, they should know that humanity possessed a weapon capable of destroying entire star systems. Vorath Prime, the homeworld of the Dominion, was within range of this weapon. The humans had refrained from using it so far, but that restraint had limits. General Kraft stared at the message for a long time. His officers waited for orders. The bridge was silent, except for the hum of engines. The fleet would halt. They would return to Council space and await further instructions. For the first time in 6,000 years, a Council military force retreated without firing a single shot at its enemy. The war had lasted less than a day, and humanity had won. The great chamber of the Galactic Council had never seen such chaos. Representatives from dozens of species shouted over each other, their voices blending into a roar that echoed off the ancient walls. Aides rushed between platforms, carrying reports filled with numbers that no one wanted to believe. High Chancellor Morath sat at the center of it all, his ancient face frozen in an expression that might have been shock or might have been fury. The reports kept coming, and each one was worse than the last. Korath's station was gone. 8,000 warships were either destroyed or disabled. The communications network across 3 sectors remained offline, and repair crews estimated it would take months to restore. 17 species had already sent private messages to human leadership, asking for separate peace negotiations. The Silthene Confederacy was threatening to withdraw from the Council entirely. The Vorath Dominion, the military backbone of the Council for 6,000 years, had retreated without engaging the enemy. General Krath stood before the assembly and tried to explain his decision. He spoke of the human weapons, the destroyed station, the broken communications. He spoke of the threat to Vorath Prime. He insisted that retreat was the only logical choice when faced with an enemy who can strike without warning and destroy without limit. Some council members understood. Others called him a coward. The Vreth delegate demanded that Krath be executed for failing the council. The debate grew more heated with every passing minute. High Chancellor Morath finally raised his hand for silence. The chamber quieted, though angry murmurs still rippled through the crowd. The Chancellor asked a simple question that no one could answer. How had this happened? The humans were supposed to be primitive. They were supposed to be weak. They were supposed to have 300 ships and weapons barely capable of scratching council armor. Instead, they had torn through the most powerful military force in the galaxy like a blade through paper. They had anticipated council strategy, exploited council weaknesses, and achieved in one day what no enemy had achieved in 40,000 years. No one had an answer. The intelligence services had failed. The military assessments had been wrong. Everything the Council believed about humanity had proven to be a dangerous illusion. Ambassador Zethral was summoned to the chamber. He was given the most difficult assignment of his long career. He was ordered to contact the humans and request a meeting to discuss terms. The word request stuck in his throat as he said it, but he had no choice. The Council had no cards left to play. The meeting took place on a small station at the edge of human space. It was neutral ground, a trading post that belonged to neither side. Admiral Daniel Harris arrived alone, wearing a simple uniform without decorations or medals. His face showed no emotion as he walked into the conference room and took his seat across from the alien delegation. Zethral had brought 50 guards and 3 diplomatic advisors. He had prepared a long speech about mutual understanding and the benefits of cooperation. But when he looked at the human across the table, the words died in his mouth. There was something in the Admiral's eyes, a quiet confidence that needed no boasting, a strength that did not care about appearances. Zethral realized that this was not a man who could be intimidated or manipulated. This was a man who had already won, and knew it. Admiral Harris spoke first. His voice was calm and even, as if he were discussing the weather rather than the fate of civilizations. Humanity would not be paying tribute, he said. Humanity would not be providing laborers. Humanity would not be submitting to council authority in any form. These points were not open for negotiation. However, humanity did not seek the destruction of the council. Humanity did not want war. Humanity had lived in peace with itself for over a century, and it was willing to live in peace with the galaxy as well. What humanity wanted was simple: recognition as an equal partner in galactic affairs. Fair trade agreements based on mutual benefit rather than forced extraction. The right to expand into unclaimed space without interference. And a formal apology for the threat of genocide. Zethral listened to these demands with a sinking feeling in his stomach. What the human was asking for was unprecedented. No species had ever joined the Council as an equal. The entire structure of galactic civilization was built on hierarchy, on the strong ruling the weak. What Harris proposed would overturn 40,000 years of tradition. The ambassador asked what would happen if the council refused. Admiral Harris smiled slightly. It was not a cruel smile, but it was not a warm one either. He reminded Zethral that humanity had refrained from using its most powerful weapon because it wished to demonstrate restraint, not inability. The hammer was still operational, Vorath Prime was still within range, and human intelligence had identified 17 other worlds whose destruction would effectively end the Council as a governing body. Humanity did not want to use these weapons, Harris continued. Humanity preferred to trade, to learn, to grow alongside other species. But humanity would not do these things on its knees. The Council could accept humanity as an equal, and there would be peace. Or the Council could continue to view humanity as a subject species, and there would be a war that would reshape the galaxy. The choice, Harris said, was simple. He had come to offer peace, but he was fully prepared to wage war if peace was refused. Zethral returned to the Council with humanity's terms. The debate lasted 3 weeks. Voices were raised. Threats were made. Some demanded that the Council mobilize every remaining ship and crush humanity regardless of the cost. Others argued that the cost would be too high, that even victory would leave the Council so weakened that other subject species might rise up. In the end, survival won over pride. The Galactic Council signed the Treaty of Equal Standing, recognizing humanity as a sovereign partner rather than a subject species. It was the first such treaty in 40,000 years of Council history. The news spread across the galaxy, and countless species watched in amazement as the mighty Council bent to the will of a civilization that had not even known it existed 30 days earlier. Years later, historians would ask High Chancellor Morath why he had agreed to the treaty. His answer was recorded and studied for generations. He said that the Council had underestimated humanity because they measured strength by age and technology. They had assumed that a young species with primitive ships could not possibly threaten an empire that had ruled the stars for 40 millennia. They had been wrong. Humans were forged by struggle, Morath explained. Their history was a long chain of wars, disasters, and near extinctions. They had fought against their own world to survive. They had fought against each other for thousands of years. They had faced challenges that would have broken most species and had emerged stronger each time. A civilization shaped by such constant pressure did not know how to surrender. It did not understand the concept of submission. It only knew how to fight, and it would fight until there was nothing left. The Council had learned something important from humanity, the Chancellor admitted. True power was not measured in ships or years. It was measured in will, in determination, in the refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat seemed certain. In that measurement, humanity had no equal. And that was why the galaxy would never forget the day when a small species from a small planet on the edge of known space stood up to the greatest power in existence and said a single word that changed everything. The massive shadow fell over New York City on a Tuesday morning in the year 2047. People stopped walking on the streets. Cars pulled over. Children pointed at the sky. A ship larger than anything humanity had ever built hung in the air above Manhattan, blocking out the sun like a second moon. Admiral Daniel Harris received the call while eating breakfast at his home in Virginia. His coffee went cold on the table as he listened to the frantic voice of his aide. Within 30 minutes, he was on a military transport heading toward the landing site. His mind raced with questions that had no answers. The ship descended slowly, almost lazily, as if it had all the time in the world. It landed in Central Park, crushing trees and pathways beneath its enormous weight. The grass burned from the heat of its engines. Thousands of people gathered at the edges of the park. held back by police barriers. Camera drones filled the air like a swarm of insects. Admiral Harris arrived just as the ship's doors began to open. Secretary of Interstellar Affairs Lisa Monroe was already there, standing with a team of diplomats and scientists. Her face was pale but composed. She had spent her entire career preparing for this moment, and now that it had come, she found herself wishing it had not. A ramp extended from the ship and touched the scorched ground. 12 figures walked down in a single line. They were not human. Each one was different from the others. Some were tall and thin, some were short and wide. Some had skin like leather. Some had scales that shimmered in the morning light. They moved with the confidence of beings who had never known fear. The leader of the group stepped forward. His name was Sethral, and he was an ambassador of the Vorath Dominion. He stood 8 feet tall, with pale blue skin and 4 arms that moved independently of each other. His eyes were black and without pupils, like pools of oil. When he spoke, a small device on his chest translated his words into English. He did not offer greetings. He did not ask to speak with human leaders. He simply began talking as if reading from a prepared statement. The Galactic Council had observed humanity for 300 years, he said. They had watched humans discover faster-than-light travel. They had monitored the colonization of 17 worlds beyond Earth. They had studied human culture, human technology, and human behavior. And now, the Council had decided that humanity was ready to join the galactic community. Admiral Harris felt a small spark of hope at these words. Perhaps this was a friendly first contact after all. Perhaps the aliens had come to welcome humanity into a larger universe of knowledge and cooperation. That hope died quickly. Zethral explained that joining the galactic community came with certain obligations. Every species under Council authority was required to pay tribute. This was not optional. This was not negotiable. This was simply how things worked in the galaxy. For humanity, the tribute demand was as follows. 50% of all mineral resources extracted from human colonies would be delivered to Council collection points. 20% of all food produced on human worlds would be shipped to feed Council populations. And 1 million humans would be provided each cycle to serve as laborers on Council worlds. Lisa Monroe's tablet slipped from her fingers and clattered on the ground. A murmur of shock rippled through the human delegation. Admiral Harris felt his hands ball into fists at his sides. One of the diplomats found his voice and asked what would happen if humanity refused. Zethral's expression did not change. He explained that refusal was not advisable. Species that refused tribute were classified as rogue civilizations. Rogue civilizations were considered threats to galactic peace and stability. Threats were eliminated. He gave an example. 4,000 years ago, a species called the Cathani had refused to pay tribute. They had been a proud and advanced civilization with a fleet of 10,000 ships. The Council had mobilized against them. The war lasted 6 months. When it was over, the Cathani were extinct. Their homeworld was now a mining colony operated by the Vorath Dominion. Their cities were dust. Their children were memories. Their entire civilization had been erased from history, as if it had never existed at all. Zethral paused to let this information settle. Then he continued. Humanity had 30 standard days to accept the tribute terms. Council representatives would return at the end of this period to collect the first payment and the first shipment of laborers. If humanity complied, they would be granted the protection of the Council and access to galactic trade networks. If humanity refused, they would share the fate of the Cathani. The ambassador turned and walked back toward his ship without waiting for a response. The other alien delegates followed him in the same orderly line. The ramp retracted. The doors closed. The massive vessel lifted off the ground, sending waves of hot air across the park. Within minutes, it was nothing but a dark spot in the sky, growing smaller and smaller until it vanished completely. Admiral Harris and Secretary Monroe stood in silence for a long moment. Around them, the diplomats and scientists talked in hushed and frightened voices. In the distance, the crowd of onlookers had begun to realize what they had witnessed. Some were crying, some were shouting, some simply stared at the empty sky with expressions of disbelief. Lisa Monroe picked up her tablet from the ground and brushed off the dirt. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady when she spoke. She told Admiral Harris that they needed to contact every world leader and every colonial governor immediately. This was not a decision one person or one nation could make. This was a decision for all of humanity. Admiral Harris nodded slowly. But before they began the calls and the meetings and the debates, he wanted to say something. He wanted to make sure she understood his position from the very beginning. Humanity had not crawled out of the mud and survived ice ages to become slaves. Humanity had not endured plagues and famines and world wars to hand over their children as laborers. Humanity had not reached for the stars just to kneel before the first aliens who demanded obedience. The Council wanted tribute. The Council expected submission. But Admiral Harris had spent 40 years in the military. He had studied every war in human history. He knew what his species was capable of when pushed into a corner. Lisa Monroe looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. She told him to assemble the Joint Chiefs and prepare a full briefing for the world leaders. If humanity was going to fight, they needed to know exactly what they were fighting against. As they walked away from the burned grass and broken trees of Central Park, neither of them spoke, but both of them were thinking the same thing. The galaxy had just made a terrible mistake. It had given humanity a deadline, and humanity had never responded well to ultimatums.